Zigi Schipper and his daughter Lou Lawrence, speaking to us about Mr. Schipper's Holocaust experiences. I know that they go around the country and give these talks to many, many schools, which is an amazing thing to do. And I'm sure we'll get a lot from what they have to say this evening. So thank you very much to you both. And I'll pass you over to Lou.
Okay, good evening, everybody. As Beth has just said, my name's Lou. I'm here this evening with my dad, Ziggy. I'm actually just going to move the camera slightly so you may not see Ziggy for the first part, but once my presentation is finished, you'll be welcome to ask my dad any questions and he'd be more than happy to answer you. You can put questions in the chat if you want, or you can just ask us at the end, whatever you want. And please don't be shy because my dad loves speaking and he'd love to speak to you all this evening. So I'm going to tell you, give you our presentation. Growing up as a child, the Holocaust was never mentioned. Sorry, bear with me 1 second. Need to just share screen. I always knew that something terrible had happened to my father when he was a child, but I never knew what. I also knew that it was a topic not to be discussed. I did know that he was born in Poland and that my mother was born in France. I also didn't learn about the Holocaust as part of my education in the 60s and 70s. A few weeks after my first child was born 33 years ago, when I was 26 years old, my husband and I were on holiday with my parents, and one evening, my husband asked my father a question about his childhood and the concentration camps during the Second World War. I was absolutely dreading my father's response. To my surprise, though, Dad answered all our questions frankly and openly. To my knowledge, that was the first time Dad had started to talk about his experiences, other than when he first came to England as a teenager, which I will tell you about a bit later. Approximately 8 years after this conversation, Dad was asked to contribute to a book which was being written by the historian Sir Martin Gilbert. The book was going to be detailing the experiences of the Holocaust survivors who came to the UK to rebuild their lives. The book was going to be called The Boys, which is what they collectively called themselves, even though some of them were actually girls. So over the course of several Sunday mornings, my sister Michelle, Dad, and I sat down with Mum looking after my boys, and we wrote Ziggy's story. This was very harrowing for me and my sister, but obviously even more so for Dad. Some years later, when we visited Poland for the first time, Dad told us that his waking thoughts each morning are the Holocaust, as are his last thoughts each night. This is one of many things about my dad that really saddens me. In order to help educate the next generation about the Holocaust and to tell people all about what happened to him and his family, my dad started speaking to schools through the Holocaust Educational Trust. The trust defines the Holocaust as the attempt by Nazi Germany and its collaborators to murder all Jews. My dad's story is just one of the millions of Jewish people who were affected by these events. So Dad was born in a large industrial city in Poland called Łódź in January 1930. At that time, the population of Łódź was approximately 600,000. Making up over 1/3 of the population, approximately 230,000 were Jews. It was the second largest Jewish community in Europe. Jews had begun settling in Poland at the start of the 18th century. The number of Jews in the whole of Poland on the 1st of September 1939, when war broke out, amounted to around 3,300,000. And at the end of the Second World War, it's estimated that there were only about 380,000 Jews remaining. When Dad was 3 years old, his parents divorced and he was brought up by his paternal grandparents. As far as he was aware, his mother had passed away. He found out many years later that she had actually gone to live in Belgium. Due to the fact that my dad's family were Orthodox Jews, the fact that my grandmother had divorced was viewed as unacceptable, and that's why he was told that she had passed away. However, his early life was fairly happy, living with his doting grandparents in an affluent area of the city. They even had a telephone in their apartment. Unlike today, where we all have at least one mobile as well as a landline, this was fairly uncommon in the early 30s. They all went to synagogue to pray every Friday night and Saturday morning. Dad has often told us the stories about going to the baker on a Friday night with a pot of cholent and collecting it on the following day after shul. And when I was doing my research, I came across this photo, which isn't our family members, but it shows the women in the village taking their pots of cholent to the baker. So it was very interesting coming across this photo because it brought to life the story that Dad had always told us.
The day they came into our town, our city, everything changed. First of all, no Jewish child was allowed to go to school.
When Dad was 9, his father woke him one morning to tell him that he needed to go away to find somewhere safe and that he would soon send for him and his grandparents. As you can imagine, this was very difficult and scary for Dad as he was only 9 years old. He had already lost his mother and now he was possibly going to lose his father as well. A lot of the young men at that time thought they could escape the invading Nazis and their collaborators, believing that they would not harm the women, children, and the elderly. How wrong they were. Dad never saw his father again. At one point, some years later, Dad heard that his father had tried to go back to Łódź, but sadly was only able to get as far as Warsaw. To this day, my dad and our family have no idea what happened to my grandfather. A couple of months later, the Nazis came into their town and life changed dramatically. Jewish businesses and schools were forced to close as part of the anti-Jewish laws that were introduced at this time. So Dad's formal education had ended when he was 9 years old. All Jews had to move to a designated area called Bawuty, which was to make up the Łódź ghetto in a very rough part of the city. My father and his grandparents moved from a very comfortable apartment to a single room on the second floor of a run-down apartment block with the toilet in the yard. They had no heat, and in the winter, the temperature could drop to as low as -18 degrees. That was when hardship really started, and now my dad was 10 years old. Between November 1939 and April 1940, the whole Jewish population of Łódź had to be forcibly resettled in the Łódź ghetto, which the Nazis renamed Litzmannstadt. The ghetto was the second largest ghetto in all of German-occupied Europe. It was going to be closed and sealed from the outside and encircled with barbed wire, which you can see on this image in front of you. Nobody would be able to get in or out. Quite a few people had fled the city, and finally the ghetto was made up of around 160,000 Jews. As soon as the gates were closed, the Germans chose a Judenältester, who was a Jewish representative leader, and he formed a committee which was to run the ghetto. My dad says that these Jews on the council were placed in an impossible position, forced to do as the Nazis demanded, but also trying to help their own people. The ghetto also had its own Jewish law enforcement and its own hospital. It was overcrowded, food was extremely scarce, disease and malnutrition were rife. Sadly, Dad's grandfather, who was strictly Orthodox and would only eat kosher food, soon, and like many others, succumbed to starvation. It's estimated that over 20% of the population of the Łódź ghetto died from the harsh living conditions. Incidentally, there were also 5,000 Roma gypsies from Austria in the Łódź ghetto, but they were confined in a segregated area. At around the same time, the Nazis also ordered that all Jews over the age of 10 were made to wear a yellow star on the back and front of their clothing at all times. To survive, everyone living in the ghetto had to find work. On this image here, you can see this is a list of all the inhabitants of the building where my dad and his family lived in the ghetto. And you can see the bottom third of this picture, which you can see all the surnames Schipper, S-Z-Y-P-E-R. Those were all my dad's family who he lived with all their dates of birth as well. So my dad was lucky enough to have found a job in a metal factory, producing various items for the German war effort. Everyone who worked received a ration book, which enabled them to obtain a small amount of food, such as bread, rice, flour, and sugar. Unfortunately, the rations became smaller and smaller as time went on, and all people ever thought about was food. All day long, they were so hungry. My father talks about coming out of his apartment building in the mornings and stepping over dead bodies. This image here is a bridge that my dad used to cross twice a day. He lived on one side of the bridge and his factory where he worked was on the other side of the bridge. Frequently, forced transports of other Jewish people from surrounding towns and cities arrived. Consequently, the ghetto became even more overcrowded. The Nazis soon found a remedy for that. In 1941, the Nazis instructed the Jewish Committee to supply a certain amount, thousands of Jews per day, for so-called resettlement. This was an impossible task because they didn't want to send anyone away. They knew that it meant sending people to their deaths. So how could they prioritize one person over another? Dad remembers that no one went to work on these days as they were ordered to stay in their homes. The Nazi soldiers and the SS, aided by the Polish police, arrived in big lorries and went from house to house, rounding up men, women, and children. This whole procedure lasted for a week. On one of these raids, Dad was taken and thrown onto a lorry. As he looked around him, he could see that on the truck with him were children, elderly, and disabled people. He instinctively knew he had to try to escape. Fortunately, he managed to jump off the truck when the SS guards were momentarily distracted. He ran and managed to hide in an abandoned house. Dad's grandmother was not taken at this time, as she, like many other people, was able to go into hiding. But by the end of that week, with little chance of help or assistance from the local Polish population, they had all returned to their homes. Eventually, Dad too returned, and at the end of the week, with no other option, he went back to work. Between 60 and 70,000 people were rounded up and taken away on these raids and were never seen again. Dad always talks about how lucky he has been throughout his life, and this was definitely one of his lucky moments. Dad continued to work in the same factory for 4.5 years until July 1944. At that time, the Germans liquidated the Łódź ghetto by systematically deporting all the inhabitants to extermination camps as the Russians were advancing on Poland. Each week, transports took people to unknown destinations. As you know, Dad was working in a metal factory, and he and all the employees at his workplace were to be moved to a factory somewhere in Germany to continue to support the war effort. When their turn came to go, they were all herded together and made to march to the railway station. They were allowed to take one suitcase each and were put on cattle trucks, still not knowing where they were going. And by the way, Dad was 14 years old at this point. This is an image of in the Łódź ghetto where they, at lunchtime, they would all spill out from the factories and there was a sort of communal soup kitchen. Everyone would go with their own bowl and they would stand by this window. They would try to get as close as possible to the window, actually, because at some points the person doing the cooking would throw out all the peelings of the vegetables and potatoes, and they felt really lucky if they managed to be able to pick up a few of these peelings that either landed on them or landed on the floor, and that's how they supplemented their food for the day.
When we came to the railway station, the first thing I said to my grandmother, I can't see any trains. She said, they're standing in front of you. I said, they're cattle trucks.
Dad says that once they were on the trucks, they were appallingly overcrowded, with around 100 people to each tiny wagon. There was nowhere to sit, and they had nothing to drink. The only food they had was what they had brought with them. There was just one bucket to use as a toilet, and the smell was horrendous. Each morning, the guards would remove bodies of those who had died overnight. Eventually, there was room for Dad to sit down. One of Dad's most upsetting memories is how he had become so dehumanized that he wished someone would die so he could sit. To this day, he often says, "How could I have had such a thought?" Early one morning, after several days of traveling in these horrific conditions, the train stopped, the guards opened the doors, and everyone was ordered off the train. They had arrived at Auschwitz. My father remembers the putrid smell and the hazy sky. From a distance, they could see billowing smoke from the chimneys. At that time, they had no idea what the smoke was, but rumors soon started spreading that the source was from the crematoria. My dad didn't even know what that meant. The crematoriums were burning the bodies of the predominantly, but not entirely, Jewish victims of the camp. On arrival at Birkenau, a selection process carried out by SS doctors and SS overseers took place constantly as train after train unloaded its human cargo. Most Jews were sent immediately to their deaths. Dad always talks about how the officers tried to rip babies from their mother's arms. If the mother refused to let go, they shot the baby through the head. Thinking about the children and babies always makes Dad so sad, and this has impacted him throughout his life. Another thing Dad always says that he cannot understand is how these officers, who mostly were highly intelligent, educated people, could do the work they did during the... Oh, sorry. Sorry, there we go. Dad always says he can't understand how these officers, who were highly intelligent, educated people, could do the work they did during the day, killing of thousands of innocent men, women, and children, and then sitting down to have dinner in the evenings with their families, listening to music, as if it were the most normal thing to do. In this image, you can see women SS guards and administrators who had been working at Auschwitz-Birkenau at around the time my dad was there. They were rewarded for good behavior with a stay at the relaxation retreat of Solu, some 20 kilometers away. I'm sure you'll agree that this image is astonishing, which is exactly what my dad always says. Dad and his work colleagues did not have to go through selection, but he was, of course, forcibly separated from his beloved grandmother, as men and women stayed in different barracks. Dad says he felt terribly lonely, and remember, his grandmother was more of a mother to him, as Dad had lived with her since his mother had left. He remembers, though, that their names were called out, they were told to leave their luggage, and were told that they would be given their belongings back. He had no reason to believe that this would not be the case. Of course, though, they never saw their possessions again. As far as we are aware, the transport Dad was on was the only transport from the Łódź ghetto that arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau with over 500 people who were all on a named list. This was because they were supposed to be going to work in another factory. The group were taken to the so-called sauna building, which was a processing block. They were forced to undress and give up whatever personal possessions they had on them, such as money, jewellery, or spectacles. Their entire bodies were brutally shaved and disinfected, and they were sent into communal showers. They were then given striped pajamas with numbers sewn on. Thus they were dehumanized, depersonalized, and completely stripped of everything, including their identities. My dad's number was 84,303, a number he can never forget. Every morning they were given a cup of artificial black coffee and a small slice of bread, which, by the way, had often been bulked up with sawdust. They were given the same in the evening, and they had nothing at all for lunch. Dad always says that he doesn't understand why they weren't given more food, as they'd been told they were going to Germany to work. They slept 3 people to a bunk, 3 bunks high, in barracks, each housing approximately 500 people. Amongst other things, the smell in the barrack was unbearable, with so many people in such a small place and with no windows for ventilation. They had to combat rats, lice, disease, and starvation. Each morning the prisoners were counted, and of course the numbers never tallied, as people hadn't survived the night. After several weeks, an order was received to say that the whole transport that had arrived from the metal factory was to be relocated. They were again piled into cattle trucks and onto an unknown destination. Eventually, they arrived at Stutthof, which was a German concentration camp near Danzig. It was a much smaller camp than Auschwitz. However, conditions were just as bad, if not worse. It was now November 1944, and the weather was bitterly cold. They had to stay outdoors all day long in freezing conditions. Dad told me that the only way to keep warm was by making what he and his friends called human ovens. A few hundred people all huddled together. As those in the middle warmed up, they went to the outside of the group, and so on. Being small and a little bit cheeky, Dad managed to sneak into the middle most of the time. Conditions were so bad that after a while, Dad didn't think he would survive. The cold, the lack of food, and no warm clothing. Then one day, some German SS officers said that they needed 20 boys to go to work on a railway line. It was so bad in Stutthof that Dad volunteered to go, as he thought it couldn't be any worse than where he was. They were taken to showers, given warmer clothing, and were this time taken by passenger train to a place called Stolp, which was a sub-camp of Stutthof and was located in a railway yard. Dad says that the conditions at the camp in Stolp were actually better than they had been at Stutthof. Dad was able to do some work on the railway lines. He was amongst 20 Polish Jewish boys who had all arrived together from Stutthof. However, they were very much in the minority, as there were already about 1,500 Latvian and Lithuanian Jews in the camp. There were also some German Jews there. Dad told me that the Polish Jews stuck together and were a very close group of friends who really looked out for each other. Whilst in Stolp, Dad witnessed something that has never left him. It was the hanging of 5 young men. Their crime was to have stolen some cigarettes. This was one of many atrocities Dad was witness to, and the image has never left him. In March 1945, Dad and the rest of the inmates of the camp were taken back to Stutthof, where conditions had deteriorated drastically. There was no electricity and very little food and water. They could hear Soviet planes flying above and bombing all around the camp. As the Allies approached and the war was coming to a close, the prisoners, like my dad, were constantly being moved about. About a month later, they were again taken to another camp called Borgraben. They woke one morning to find that all the guards had abandoned the camp. Dad, who was very ill with typhus, hoped that the Russians would liberate them. However, the next morning they were horrified to see German SS troops, who herded them into luxury coaches this time, to take them to Danzig. From Danzig, they were taken on a forced march to the harbour town of Gdynia, where they were forced onto barges. They had no food or water and certainly no medication. After days on the barge, the Germans returned and they were forced onto a death march.
Gdańsk was completely on fire, bombed from the Allies. And we walked, and I needed water badly, and there was no chance of getting water. I couldn't walk, but my friends helped me. They used to pick up snow that was still accumulated from all the snow that was coming down. And they used to give me that because I had no water, so I put that in my mouth. Anyway, I carried on and on and on. We walked. Eventually, we arrived to a Polish port. We didn't see boats, but we saw barges. And they slung us into those barges.
Dad describes what happened next as utter chaos. The SS fled and suddenly British tanks were everywhere. Dad somehow managed to crawl over to a soldier and ask him in German for some water. That was the first water Dad had drunk for days, and it was the 3rd of May, 1945, the day of my dad's liberation by the British Army. Dad says that his only thought and that of his friends was that now they would be able to eat. All they thought about during those long, terrible years was hunger and food. Dad told us all that he now regards 3rd of May as his second birthday, a day which allowed him to live again. In the days following liberation, they all ate so much, having been starved for over 5 years, first in the ghettos, then in the camps, that thousands of people actually died, some from disease and some from the effects of overeating. After a few days, Dad had to be admitted to hospital, where he recuperated for 3 months. He had been so ill, he had to learn how to walk again. On leaving hospital, Dad stayed in a children's home near Neustadt, together with other child survivors. During this time, Dad had to go back to hospital again for a small operation, and whilst there, he received a letter with an English postmark. The letter was from a woman who thought that Dad might be her son, who had lived in Lodz, Poland, before the war. She had found his details on a Red Cross list in London, but his year of birth was incorrect. In the letter, she asked him to look at his left wrist to see if there was a burn mark which she knew had happened to him when he was 3 years old. He did so, and then he knew that the letter was indeed from his mother. Dad felt numb and shocked. This woman was both a stranger to him and his mother. They did, however, correspond over several months, and although Dad had planned to go to Palestine with his friends, who he felt were more his family, he was encouraged by his friends and the carers at the children's home where he was living to go to live with her in England. This would take time to arrange, so when he left hospital for the second time, he went to live in a beautiful home in Hamburg, which had been donated by the Warburgs, who were a wealthy German Jewish banking family. This house was to serve as a children's home for orphans. Girls and boys were in separate dormitories with 3 or 4 to each room. He said all the children were so happy as they were all preparing to go to Palestine, which is of course now Israel. They had as much food as they wanted, which is mostly all they thought about in those early days. What struck me about this photo is that everyone in it, the children and the adults, were all on their own and mostly sole survivors of their families. Some, like Dad, eventually found that they did have family members in different countries who they eventually went on to live with.
My mother found me. She found me on my name on a Red Cross list, but the date of my birth wasn't correct. And she wasn't sure whether I was her son or not, but she said she remembered when I was about 3 years old. I burned myself on my left wrist, and she said, if you have a look, if there is a scar on the wrist, and if there is, you are my son. And I had a look, and I looked at my friends that brought me that letter, and I said, you know, for 11 years, I thought my mother was dead, but she wasn't. She was living in England.
Dad and his fellow survivor friends lived very well for the first time in 5 years. They went to cinemas, concerts, the opera, and generally enjoyed themselves. He believes that this is where he found his love of the opera and classical music. Many months later, Dad was very sad when he waved goodbye to all his friends to board the ship for England. He was sad because these friends had become family to him, and once more he was all alone going to a strange country, not knowing anyone and not even knowing the language. After a week at sea, he arrived in Hull, north of England, to be met by a man who turned out to be his stepfather, who took him home to finally meet his mother. Dad laughs when he tells us that his stepfather asked him where his luggage was. He didn't realize that the small paper bag Dad was holding was in fact everything he possessed. For the first 6 months, Dad didn't do very much except go to the cinema, eat, drink, and sleep. He then went to evening classes to learn English and found a job in tailoring. He hadn't made any friends and he felt quite lonely and was really struggling to adjust to life in England. Then one day he met someone who mentioned that there was a Jewish youth club in Belsize Park, North London, where young Holocaust survivors met up. So one Saturday evening, he went to a dance organised by the club. As he walked in, he recognised boys who he had been with both in the ghetto and also in the camps. These boys and girls were collectively known as the boys who I mentioned at the start of my talk. From then on, everything in his life changed. My dad always says that from the moment he walked into the club that day, he felt like he had finally found his family again, and he really started to live. After a few months, he met a beautiful French girl called Jeanette, who was also a refugee and had come to the UK in 1939. They met at the club and started dating. And in this photo here, Jeanette is right at the top of the pyramid. Eventually they got married, and 2 years later, in 1956, my sister Michelle was born. 5 years later, I came along. After the birth of Michelle, Dad felt that he finally had a family of his own. Dad now has 6 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. Dad has been back to Auschwitz, firstly with my sister and myself, and subsequently on many educational tours. One of the things I remember about our first trip was how my dad hugged my sister and me and said that Hitler had not won and that we were the living proof.
I'm Alex Moz, the head of education at the Holocaust Educational Trust. We're an educational charity. Ziggy is one of the survivors who does a lot of work with the Holocaust Educational Trust. He speaks on our behalf in schools and colleges up and down the UK, tirelessly sharing his story with young people so that they can put a human face and a human voice to the story of the Holocaust. People, when they meet Ziggy, are always blown away by the fact that someone who endured some of the most horrific human experiences that anyone could ever imagine is such a warm, friendly, positive, and incredibly heartwarming person today. And the fact that in spite of everything that he's been through, he goes around the country telling young people not to hate one another is quite remarkable.
Dad has met countless prime ministers and the Queen. He accompanied the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge when they visited Stutthof concentration camp in July 2017. Dad was particularly chuffed to have been asked to watch the England men's football team at a training session before giving a talk ahead of the Euro 2012 championships, which took place in Ukraine and Poland. Dad said at the time how surprised he was that the footballers were so quiet and respectful when he spoke. Dad told the players that they are role models and that they must spread the message about the Holocaust. He feels that young people will listen to the likes of Steven Gerrard and Wayne Rooney. Being a huge football fan, and by the way, his team is Arsenal, Dad always says this was the greatest honour of his life, but the players at the time insisted the honour was all theirs. Joe Hart, the goalkeeper, specifically asked to visit Auschwitz, having heard Dad's talk, and immediately texted his dad to tell him all about meeting my dad. Dad has been the subject of several television documentaries, including one which was produced by his grandson, Darren Richman. He even has a Facebook page and an Instagram page. In December 2015, Dad was awarded the British Empire Medal in the Queen's New Year's Honours List for his contribution to Holocaust education and awareness. When asked how he felt, Dad said he owed it to the people who didn't survive. Many years after Dad's arrival in England, he discovered that his grandmother had died the day of liberation in Theresienstadt, a ghetto camp in what was Czechoslovakia. He always wished he could have had one more day with her to thank her for everything she did for him. The saddest thing for Dad is that he never found out where and when his father perished, and so he doesn't have a specific day of the year to say Kaddish for him. Dad's message to everyone is not to hate, to be kind, and to be tolerant. In spite of everything that Dad has endured during his lifetime, and especially during his early years, he is the most positive of people.
You know, for a Holocaust survivor that lost almost everything, having children, grandchildren, you know, when I look at them, I look up to heaven, and I say, you see, Hitler did not succeed. He might have killed 6 million of us, but he did not succeed. You are proof.
Dad always says he's had the most wonderful life and that he could never thank the British people enough for all they have given him.
I tell the young people, don't hate. We are all the same. What difference is it? Whether you're a Jew or a Muslim or a Christian. It's only different places of worship at the end of the day. There's only one God.
I can't begin to tell you how proud I am of my dad and what he has achieved in his life. And I feel honoured to have had the opportunity to tell his story to you this evening. And thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you so much, Lou. And wow, quite stunned actually. Has anybody got any questions they'd like to ask Lou and Ziggy? You'd like to put it in the chat room now?
We usually find that people are quite stunned at first.
Yeah, that's
it's
how
quite
I
a lot. It's quite a lot to take in.
It must be hard for you retelling this as well every time, Lou.
Yeah, it is. It's not easy, and the build up to it, and then afterwards as well. But it's an important message to be giving, and it's really important because of all the problems in the world.
I think the most obvious question I'm thinking of is what kept you going, Ziggy?
What kept you going, Dad?
Sorry?
What kept you going?
Through all the hell that you experienced.
When you were in the camps and when you were in the ghetto?
Well, you know, I never thought that I'll die, you know, except once when I was in Stutthof because it was so cold, so freezing. And I couldn't understand. We are going to do some work for the Germans. Why didn't they give us more food, warm, best everything? But they didn't. I don't know. You know, but I never thought I was going to die. I don't know why, you know. I saw people, my friends next to me, getting up in the morning and they were dead, you know. I just don't know. It was pure Well, like my mother used to say, you got to be lucky.
Lucky.
Lucky. If you're not lucky, you shouldn't be born. You know. But I just don't know how I survived. People always ask me, were you very strong or something? How come? I was a youngster of 10 years old, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. You know, no. But I've survived. And people now ask me, I don't know how.
There's another question. I think we've got another question
We've
in the
got a
chat.
couple of questions. Can you explain how your mother came to England? And if you would also like, how did your relationship develop with her? Because Lou had said that it was obviously very difficult at the beginning because you didn't know your mother.
I've got to repeat, Beth, because it's quite quiet. I need to just repeat it to my dad. So first of all, can you say, how did your mum come to be in England? How did she get to England?
Well, she later, when I was already here and I saw her, then we discussed it many times how she came to England. She lived in
Belgium.
Belgium. You know, when the Germans started getting in there, they went to the south of France because the south of France wasn't taken over by the Germans. They took the whole of Germany, but not the south of France. And eventually they started doing it. So my stepfather and my mother and some other people started to go up through the mountains. They get some people to do it and they had to pay for it. And eventually they finished in Spain. And Spain wasn't, it was the Germans enjoyed it.
Occupied.
But they did not occupy. You see, and they stayed in a camp, but it was an open camp. They didn't go anywhere, but they got food and everything. And one day, a British chap from the
Army. From the army.
Not from the army.
Oh.
That was there. You know, every country has got it.
The embassy.
The embassy. So. And he came over and he says, anybody that wants to go to the British Army, we will bring over to England. So my stepfather and my mother agreed, yes, and eventually in 2019, I don't know, but only they finished up in 42 in Britain. And he went to the army, but he wasn't a good soldier. They let him go, you know. And then
But that was how they came to be in Britain.
I was in Britain and I had loved everything I saw, except working in that sailing.
Tailoring. Right.
I didn't like it.
They also asked, how was your relationship with your mother?
My relationship with my mother was existing as unbelievable. Every time we used to kiss each other and everything. And, you know, many times my mother wanted to say, I wish I wouldn't have left you. And I say, don't talk about it anymore, because maybe if you would have been as well, both of us would have been killed. So at least we are here. Unfortunately, he didn't live very long, but he died when she was in the 60s, you know. So, but eventually, you see, I left what I was doing.
The tailoring.
And I went when I used to go to the place every Saturday or Sunday, where we with a group of the people,
At the Jewish Youth Club.
you know, and when I went there, you know, eventually I found that girl and I said to her, you know, I think we've met before. And she said, oh yes, what are you talking about? Well, it was, I did meet her because her parents and my mother and my stepfather, they went to the dog racing once and they were there as well. But then I didn't see her for a while. I didn't know. So when she came to the Primrose Jewish Youth Club, I didn't know her, she didn't know me. But then one day I said to her, I think that I've met you before. And she said, oh no, you're trying to say something. I said, no, it's the truth. I said, did you go to the dogs with your mum and dad and your sister, your young sister? Oh yes, so she knows. So she knew me as Ziggy.
Ziggy, was she in the camps as well? Did she come from Europe? No?
No. Explain how Mum came. She's asking about Mum. Was Mum in the camps as well?
No.
Explain how Mum came.
My mother, no, I explained already.
Not your mum, your wife, Jeanette.
Oh, my wife. Yes, my wife came in 1939 with her little sister.
No, she wasn't.
Without a little sister, with her mother and father
from France,
from Prague.
Yep.
You know, but it was already gone from Prague because they.
Thank you. Somebody wants to know: did you keep in contact with the friends you made who moved to Israel?
Did you stay in contact with your friends who moved to Israel?
That went to Israel, yes. And I used to go when everything went and I started working in a different thing, not in tailoring. I had 2 shops and a place for
printing factory.
Printing factory.
Explain about the 45
shops.
Explain about the 45 Aid Society and the reunion every year.
And the people that I met in the 45 Aid Society, you see, they are still today. It was Primrose Jewish Youth Club to begin with. Oh, my life completely changed, you know. And I had a most wonderful, wonderful life up till now. Unfortunately, nearly a year ago, my wife died. She was 89. She was also ill. And she died. And this is the worst thing that I went through since I came to Britain.
Can I just explain about to answer that question? The Jewish Youth, the Primrose Jewish Youth Club then turned into the 45 Aid Society, which I'm sure probably most of you have heard of. And the boys and girls who went to live, some went to live in Israel, some went to America, some went to Canada, and some, of course, the UK, but stayed here. They have a reunion every year, and they all met up. A lot of them used to come over from overseas to meet up every year for their reunion, which started off when in their younger days, there would be like a dinner and dance. And as the years have gone on and they've all got older, they still have something every year, of course, not the last 2 years because of the pandemic. But now the 2nd, 3rd, and even 4th generation go along to these events. So it's really lovely. And for my sister and I, it's like being with family. We've got the biggest family in the world.
Right.
Yes.
Wendy Rose has put that, firstly, thank you for a very moving presentation. And she said that she was a bridesmaid at her cousin's wedding to Krulnik Wilder.
Krulek is Dad's
remembers,
best friend.
yeah, and remembers Ziggy from family bar mitzvahs, and the boys were the life and soul of the party.
Absolutely. So she was one of Gloria's bridesmaids. Did she? No.
Just says cousin's wedding to Krulnik. Wendy.
So her cousin was Gloria. So
When
there's
did you want to
Yes,
unmute yourself?
she was my first cousin. She was
so
my
there's
first
Lady here
cousin.
who was Gloria's first cousin, Krulek.
Krulek
And she
and-
was a
Krulek
bridesmaid
and
at their
I were
wedding.
like brothers, 100%. You
So
know?
this lady here was Krulek's first cousin, and she was a
Yeah.
bridesmaid at their wedding. Well, you were at the
well,
wedding
Of
as
course,
well.
I
Yes,
was at the wedding.
yes.
You
But
know?
I remember you from the bar mitzvahs, all the boys' bar mitzvahs.
Very noisy.
Yes, bar mitzvah.
Oh my
Very
goodness
big.
me. They were, but he was the life and soul of the party, Ziggy. Everybody knew Ziggy, that it didn't even know him, you know. It was
You
lovely.
and Krulek were a good double act.
Yes.
Yes.
But
Yes.
unfortunately, Krulek couldn't speak to tell people about it like I did, like my other boys and girls that
Yes.
been all over. I spoke in Britain, not
Yes.
England,
Yes.
complete Britain. You know, to Scotland, to Wales, to Northern Ireland. I spoke there, and up till today, people speak to me about it.
Yes. Yes.
And I spoke everywhere I did. I used to go to speak, to tell the people, because it is so important for us.
Absolutely. And it's important for other people to hear and to know about it as well as you being able to speak about it.
Yeah.
Yes. People are, the students, when I spoke, always asked me questions, quite a lot of questions. And many of them says, are you still religious? I said, could you tell me what religion is? And I asked that the chief rabbi, the one now, that was and the one that is now, could you tell me what religion is? Is it for me? So to the students, I said, look, as a Jew, I should go twice a day to the shul, to
shul. Yes.
Yeah, to shul.
to the shul. So I said I didn't do that. And I asked that people, I said, tell me, what is religion? Going to twice a day to shul, that will do nothing. If you help people, if you see somebody fall down, go and pick him up. If you come on a train and you see a lady with a baby, or she's got a big tummy, just get up and say, please, would you like to sit down? To me, this is religion.
Yes.
And other
Yes.
things like that.
When you say it's being a mensch.
Yes.
Right,
Yes.
Daddy, there's more questions.
Yeah, we've got what changed for you that you decided to speak about your experiences?
Well, I touched on that. So when Sir Martin Gilbert was writing a book, which was going to be called The Boys, if Dad wanted to be in the book, he had to write his testimony. So once he wrote his testimony, which I spoke about right at the beginning, where we sat down every Sunday morning and started. We didn't have laptops in those days, so I wrote everything down and then we typed it up. And then once he'd started talking about it, round about the same time, he met Karen Pollock, who is the CEO of the Holocaust Educational Trust. It was all round about the same time. And he got chatting with her and she told him about the work they did. And she asked him whether he would be willing to start giving his talks at schools. And it all kind of happened at the same time and went from there. So the book was written and published. And Dad started talking. It was all about the same time, wasn't it, Dad? So once he started, having spent so many years not talking, when he started, he then didn't stop, actually.
I got every week, once, twice, it depends where, right up in Scotland in the mountains. Never mind that they never met a Holocaust survivor. They've never met even a Jew in some places up in Scotland.
Dad, someone's asked, how did you come to be wearing a British Army uniform?
Ah, well, the problem was, you know, when I was 3 months in a hospital, and whatever I was wearing, they got rid of. And so a nurse came over. It was already a German nurse, but the doctors and everybody else, they were British. So she says, you'll be able to soon to leave. I said, what will I wear? I've got no clothes. So she said, I'll see what I can do. So she came back with a British uniform. So she
From
says,
her boyfriend.
of course, from the boyfriend. So she says, but you've got to promise me that when you get it and go wherever you are going to go, you've got to change it. You've got to
Dye it a
dye
different
it
colour.
in a different color or something. I said, of course, I'll do it. Anyway, she took it and she brought it back a few days later and she gave it to me. I remember what you said. I said, yes. But I did not do anything. I kept on being stopped in the German streets by the British Army because they saw a little fellow like me with an open neck. So they started talking to me. I didn't understand them. They didn't understand me. So they took me to the place. They got somebody to translate. So they said, yes, it's all right. But you must not go in the streets with it. So I did. But all I can tell you, I've got pictures of it. And I wore it. I kept on being taken all the time by the police. But the funny thing is, I don't know what happened to it. I must have left it in Germany when I came to Britain.
Mm.
But there are pictures of me full all of them, you know.
There's
Somebody's.
Sorry, Beth.
No, go ahead.
Cesar saying it twice.
Yeah, sure.
So Nicola has asked, what stopped you talking about?
Pardon?
Why didn't you talk about it all before you met Karen and everything?
Well, we used to speak to somebody, but that's all one, two. We didn't go anywhere to speak, you know. But then, you know, we stopped the Primrose Jewish Youth Club. We all were separate and we were very busy. We got married, we had children, we had married. And then, because of Karen Pollock, the head, she made me speak.
Yeah, I said that.
And
but you
that's
didn't,
why
yeah, but
speak.
you didn't speak before. You said you didn't think people would believe you. None of you thought people would believe it. When you first came, when you were young, when you first came.
No, we didn't talk amongst ourselves all the time, but we never spoke to anybody. Not even our children, not even our husband and wife. You know, we never spoke to them, but they found something. So every time they used to come to my parents and they used to ask, tell me what happened. I said, yeah, I was in a camp and so on. And so. But then I started speaking properly and I enjoyed every minute because I told them, and some of them, even today, they are now like Holocaust ambassadors. You see, they're Holocaust ambassadors. Thousands and thousands of them, all from us that they've heard, because always they were interested in it. Black people and white people, all of them, the young people. It didn't make any difference whatsoever.
Thank you so much, both of you, to share this with us. think we all feel honoured to have heard your story, and I hope you continue many healthy years ahead of yourself to be able to tell your story to many, many more people. And I think the Rabbi would like to end with saying memorial prayer for people that have been lost.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks again to you both, Ziggy and Lou. I mean, really, a really great double act. You both are together. It's wonderful to see how well you do it together. Ziggy, you are really one special individual. You have reached thousands of students, haven't you, over the last, how many decades? 25 or so years. And that is incredible to be able to bring your memories, right, to become more real to the people who are young and who will take that up into their lives and pass that hopefully on to their children. What an incredible legacy you've left for so many thousands of children across the country, and of course to us here tonight. And we salute you for that. But we want you to know that your legacy is also safe in the generation beyond's hands, and with your daughter as well and your family. What a wonderful presentation as well, so helpful.
Can I just say, Rabbi, sorry to interrupt you, that my sister also, who's on the call to this evening with us, she also does these presentations with my dad. It's not just me.
Oh, that's it. What's your sister's name?
Michelle.
Michelle. So hello, Michelle. Lovely to there we are. Oh, well done. Well done, Beth. Hi, Michelle. All right, that's really good. And I think we also need to take our hat off to the Holocaust Educational Trust, who do incredible work. Yeah. Karen has done wonderful work for that organization in making it so important for many of you who have survived and are here to be able to tell your story, engage, and answer questions like, as you said, what does it mean to be religion? If you can't get the basics of kindness right, if you can't get the basics of being good to other people and being there for others, what is it all about? And I think that really was sobering to hear that from you, Ziggy, and that certainly puts us all in our place. And I hope that your message goes out to those in society today, that we continue and we better society, that it's less extreme, less aggressive, and more together.
You see, whenever I speak, the last thing I say to people, whatever you do, don't hate. Hate is the worst thing that can happen. It will be so bad, eventually you will be like that. So don't be it. You must not, especially to young people, And one day, my daughter said to me, "Dad, sometimes you tell lies." I said, "Why?" "What about the footballer?" "I won't tell you who." "Why the footballer?" "You hate." So I said, "You are right. From now on, I don't hate him. I just don't like him." That's how it is. If you don't like somebody, fair enough, but don't hate him. Hate is the worst that can happen to you. And I say that every time I spoke, I said that this is the worst there is. But
thank you, Ziggy.
Rabbi, can I just say something else? Because you said about the students and the impact that my dad has had on all these thousands of students, which he absolutely has, I just want to read you a tweet that someone tweeted yesterday on Twitter. If those of you who know what Twitter is, it's a social media platform. And she said, "I met Ziggy around 5 years ago. He was the first survivor I met, and his testimony has inspired me ever since. 5 years later, and I'm devoting my BA dissertation, KCL, to him, at War Studies to him. Survivor testimony is our most valuable source. Thank you also, Holocaust UK, which is Holocaust Educational Trust." So I just wanted to say that, and we get messages like this really frequently. And it is, as you can see, I'm so moved and always so humbled by my dad. But these messages we get are just fantastic.
That's wonderful.
Why not? We don't do anything. We don't ask. We just want you people that have got children, young children, talk to them about it. Not when they are 8, 9 years old. That's not so good. But once it's 12, 13, and you've got to tell the children what the Holocaust was.
I mean, you could not put it better than that. In a million years, you could. There's nothing more to add. That's so well put, Ziggy. Really, so well put. So let's say a prayer now. We can at least say a tefillah, a memorial prayer for those. Of course, it was till recently Yom HaShoah, the Yom HaShoah, Yom HaZikaron L'Shoah U'Legvura, the day of remembering of the destruction of course, Jewry are not complete, we should add, but of course they Shoah, and of the might as well, because this day is in memory also of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, when Jewish people, of course, said in 1943 it was, no more, we're not going to stand, we know what our fate is, but we will fight as well. El Malei Rachamim, Shoichein Bamroimim, Amtsei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, B'malot Kedoshim Utorim, Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmat Kol Elu Shenisfu, B'Shoat Europa Shalchu L'Olamam, Ana Bala Rachamim Et Menuchatam, Yastirehu B'Seiter Knafav L'Olamim, B'Tzror Achaim Et Nishmotam, Adonai Hu Nachalatam, V'yanuchu b'shalom al mishkavotam, v'nomar Amen. Thank you, Ziggy. Thank you, Lou. And obviously, thank you to all of you who came as well. This will be recorded. This has been recorded as well, which is really, really great. We'll have all of the questions and the comments as well. Maybe over to you, Beth. Thank you, Beth, because Beth is doing a wonderful job for our community, putting on really good quality events to bring us together. Maybe over to you for the last word, Beth.
Thank you again to both of you. What a privilege we've had to meet both of you, both inspirations in your own way. And I'm sure everybody would like to unmute themselves and give a big round of applause to both of you. Thank you very much for this evening.
Excellent. Wonderful.
Thank you, Ziggy. Thank you, Lou. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Amazing.
Very moving story. Thank you.
Thank you. We haven't been able to read all the messages. Beth, if you could send them to me, that would be really great.
Okay.
Anytime you want to speak to us, just ring or write, whatever, and we will tell you exactly what it is.
You're all invited to tea then, Ziggy, yeah?
Say that again, Beth.
You're all invited over to tea.
Definitely, as soon as we can, 100%.
Socially distanced tea.
They can all come over for tea in the garden. Yeah, come over for tea in the garden.
My mum and dad could come around the corner.
Yes,
and Beth's
but
mum
don't
as well.
forget the whisper.
And my sister and I are great bakers, so we can supply lots of cake.
I'm coming tomorrow.
No, I can't, definitely can't.
We're lining up.
Take care, everyone.
Lovely to see you. Night, Tom. Keep well.
Bye.
Bye.
Lovely to see you, Michelle, as well.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, Ros.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks for organising it. It's been wonderful.
Bye, Beth.
Well done,
Bye.
Beth. Well done,
Thank
Beth.
you.